Okay, so we're going to depart deductions just for a second, and we're going to talk about losses. And I mentioned earlier in this video set, the Chapter 6 video set, when we talked about reasonable. And we talked about how related party transactions can be subject to greater scrutiny. And that's because you may not necessarily transact with a related party at acceptable market values. So maybe your parents sell you a car for much less than it's worth, right? Because they're just giving you the family discount. So let's talk about what can happen in situations where there's a related party transaction that gives rise to a loss. So Donald owns 100 shares of stock in MySpace. And he purchased it a while ago, a long time ago, at $10 a share. Now, of course, it's only worth $2 a share. And if you're not familiar with MySpace, it was the predecessor to Facebook. Anyway, so it's way down in value. But the reality is he thinks, gosh, I want to recognize the loss because, I have this paper loss, I have this unrealized loss that I'd like to realize and then recognize. But I'm not prepared. Donald's not quite prepared to give up on MySpace because he's thinking, maybe it could come back. It could bounce back like Twitter did and recover all its price, and then he'd, be a billionaire. So instead he says, all right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sell this stock to my wholly owned corporation, Trump Corp. And so he's going to sell it at market value, right? It's worth $2 a share. So he sells it for $2 a share. His cost was $1,000. And so he incurs an $800 loss. And so he's really psyched, right? Because he's like, hey, look at that. I'm going to go ahead and capture this loss, but I haven't really realized it economically because Trump Corp and I, we're related parties, so we're kind of the same thing. Well, Code Section 267 disallows losses on sales between related parties. So let's see what happens then if Trump Corp ultimately tries to sell the stock later, right? So Trump Corp became the owner of this MySpace stock. And let's say it turns around and under scenario A decides to sell it for $1,200. All right, well, first we have Donald's sale, which we just covered, right? So he generates that $800 loss. None of it is recognizable. All $800 is deferred. And then Trump Corp comes along and sells that MySpace stock for $1,200. Well, their basis was $200. Recall that's what they paid Donald for the stock. So they have a realized gain of $1,000. Well, they're actually allowed to capture that related party loss of $800, and therefore they would only recognize the gain or loss of $200. In this case, it's a gain of $200. So in many respects, it's as if Donald sold it to the third party for that same $1,200. It just so happens the gain's going to be captured by Trump Corp. Okay, let's see what happens if Trump Corp sells it for $800, scenario B. Well, Donald's transaction doesn't change at all. He's still got the $800 loss. Now, Trump Corp sells it for $800, and so they generate a realized gain of $600. Well, they're only permitted to use that deferred loss up to the amount of the realized gain that they generate. So as a result, they can only use $600 of that $800 deferred loss. So they don't recognize any gain, so that's good news. But that $200 of deferred loss that went unused just evaporates. It's gone. No one's ever going to be able to claim that. So let's see what happens if Trump Corp sells it for only $100. So again, Donald's transaction, no change. It's all the same, right? Donald sells it to Trump Corp, has his $800 deferred loss. Well, because Trump Corp now sells it at a loss, they're not permitted to claim any of that deferred loss. So they end up with their own recognized loss of $100, but Donald's deferred loss of $800 evaporates and is gone. So you can see where related party transactions are subject to rules that disallow those losses for fear that maybe the transaction's not taking place or it's income shifting or, in this case, trying to create a recognition while not actually incurring the economic loss. Okay, so another place this happens is in related parties when an accrual-based taxpayer tries to accrue and therefore deduct costs to a cash basis related party. And the reality is they may not accrue those costs until they are actually paid. So GG Corp accrues a bonus to its sole shareholder, Gordon, but GG Corp will not be permitted to deduct that bonus until it is actually paid to Gordon, since he is a related party. So that should say Gordon, not GG. Paid to Gordon, since he is a related party. All right, let's take a break right there.